Thapelo, thank you so much for making the time to talk to us. Happy Easter.
Thank you, and hi to your viewers. Happy Easter to you too, ma.
As an analyst, are you getting the sense that South Africa is just so action-filled politically these days?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of South Africans, particularly, of course, if you look at social media, a lot of people are quite interested in the developments of the ANC. People are interested in sort of the developments in the DA, and there's a particular frame through which they interpret those developments, and that's quite clear-cut. You know, in a sense, there's a sort of binary, I think, that sort of encapsulates this frame in which people see the DA and the ANC. But I think it's quite important, and I think it's good that people are interacting with the political system.
So, is it just a need to attract book sales, or is it a political move for Tony Leon to come out and talk in this way about Mmusi Maimane? Failed experiment. That's quite harsh.
Look, I think I saw an earlier interview by him that, the idea of failed experiment is not in the book. I've not read the book, but I suspect, of course, that, that notion may come out in different ways or written differently in the book. And I don't know, I don't understand his motivations for the book. Again, one would have to read the book to understand his motivation. But again, this is quite important to document political struggles, whether inside political parties, in government, or just in society in general. But it's quite interesting, of course, and in terms of the way in which he's articulated Mmusi Maimane's tenure inside the DA. I think we need to move at least from the premise that South Africa is a racially charged country, and inevitably you'd have these associations where people say, well, this is racist, blah 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 blah. But at the same time, again, it's quite difficult to speak about this because one has not read the book. But it would be interesting to see the extent to which Tony grapples with the notion that actually the DA needed to change, that the DA at the time of Mmusi Maimane entering was looking to make a wholesale change, at least in terms of one, attracting majority voters, and that naturally meant that they had to change either the ideological framework or at least just shift it in a manner that's able to accommodate and incorporate all of these voters. So one does not have a sense that maybe that he will articulate this in the book, at least from the interviews that I've seen him make and the article. One does not get a sense that he's able to also see the other side to this, as opposed to the sort of wholesale a failed experiment on the part of Mmusi Maimane, which I think is an unfortunate assessment of his tenure for the DA, in fact.
So the assertion or the insult, if you like, is directed towards one individual, but of course there's a sense that it's directed towards a nation. What's your sense of it? Is it just about, is it just a scrutiny of Mmusi's leadership style and how he got into the party? Or is it the sense that the white population still struggles to reach out to, for lack of a better word, reach out to the black community?
Definitely your later point around the difficulty of the constituency or the traditional constituency of the DA to incorporate the black voters. So if I was a DA member or DA leader sitting on one of those benches or the KZN or in parliament, I'd certainly be worried about the characterization that's associated with Mmusi Maimane by a founding member, at least of the DA, from the DP times up until now, what you have. Because then obviously I would take it as that also being personal to me. So and it's quite important what Mmusi Maimane had also said just recently now on the issue of who's experimenting, who's been experimented on, and who's the person experimenting. That's quite an important question. So inevitably the black people, those who are inside the DA, obviously have to play or they have a mandate to obviously incorporate more black voters, to incorporate or to increase the base or the voter base of the DA. So that's quite clear, and that's quite different from where the DA has been traditionally. And I think since Mmusi Maimane has left, it will obviously go back to its traditional constituency, which again puts a spotlight on the current members of the DA, which were put in there to sort of widen the voter base of the DA. So certainly, I think it's a precarious position. The statement by Tony is not directed, I think, at Mmusi Maimane alone. I think this has wider, ramifications for those inside the DA who do not associate with its traditional voter base.
Let's talk about developments within the African National Congress now. We haven't heard anything as yet since the morning started, but today is supposed to be the day when so-called RET members go out to the streets and try to reconnect with branch members and ANC members on the ground and try to convince them to coax the mother body into letting Secretary General Magashule stay in his position, because we know from that meeting, that NEC meeting that took place last weekend, that protracted step-aside debate taking place and deciding that he should step down in the next 30 days. Is this a good move for these supporters to try and coax the party?
Look, I think the ANC-NEC has dug its heels on the step-aside rule. I don't see them moving away from it. I think they've been quite clear about what should happen. Although, of course, the problem there is that the step-aside rule relies or, is based on the sort of ethical persuasion of individual ANC leaders and members. So it's not a rule or an instruction to that extent. I think it would be very difficult to sustain it as a rule, given the sort of constitutional implications or the legal implications. Because I think there are people who would be able to, take to court on those matters. So we'll see how that sort of plans out. But I think on the part of the supporters of Ace Magashule, I'm not quite sure if there's a lot of appetite inside the ANC to have a sort of nationwide protest right now. I definitely expect that there will be people on the ground protesting here and there, but I don't expect it in the way in which they've articulated it. I think there's been a loss of appetite since the days of Ndate Jacob Zuma and his supporters, and how that has weakened the ANC's public standing, at least in the eyes of its voter base, and subsequent to the electoral losses it has sustained over the years. So to that extent, I don't think there's a lot of appetite. And I think the ANC, however, needs to wrestle with this notion of step aside, whether it should be separate or it should be part of its sort of disciplinary code. If I may make one more point, I think it would have been better, given how the SG has positioned himself outside of ANC-NEC discussions, outside of the agreements that are entailed in the NEC meetings. I think that would have been a better way to say, but you've articulated yourself outside of agreements of the NEC. And this is a problem, as opposed to the step-aside rule, which can have legal and constitutional implications for the ANC in a manner that I think would not be sustainable. So I think, there's a manner in which they have to also apply themselves as to what's going to happen in those 30 days. Those are sort of my thoughts around those issues, largely.
It's interesting that you say that some members would have a leg to stand on in terms of approaching the courts about this. But doesn't the fact that this is a conference resolution give it weight and strength?
Yes, remember, it's a conference resolution, yes, but it's underpinned by, the expectation that members and leaders will be ethically persuaded, given the ethos and values of the ANC. It's expected that once leadership comes to you and says, well, this is what's happening, here's a court case, here's an issue, could you please step down? That does not rely on sort of any legal injunction. In fact, any manner of trying to impose that would definitely, have recourse to the courts. Courts at least would be the final arbiter on that issue. So I think there is definitely a way for the ANC to sort of sidestep that issue and then have recourse in terms of its disciplinary mechanisms, at least when it concerns the SG. So it would be interesting, I remember a few years ago there was this injunction that no, stop taking the ANC to court. But I think it was Gwede Mantashe who had in fact articulated that. But years later, we now have the recent case of the Free State. It was taken to court, and there's just been adjudication on that matter. So it would be interesting how then the step aside rule is able to circumvent some of those issues.
So that activation of supporters going out to ground this week, apparently one of their demands is for an interim or midterm National General Council. How practical is this under prevailing situations of COVID-19 and social distancing in that?
Yeah, no, look, I think it's going to be very difficult. I mean, that's definitely has been the suspicion that, the attempts to look for or to move towards a national conference, of course, given the factional politics inside the ANC, but COVID-19 has put quite a damper on quite a lot of initiatives in the country. We are, by certain projections, we're looking at another wave, so a third wave in that matter. So I can't imagine that there'd be a national conference, precisely also because the ANC has not, properly formalized its systems for it to at least go and have a virtual conference, as we saw with the Democratic Alliance. So I think that's going to fall on deaf ears. I think it's not going to work on the part of Ismagashule supporters. I think they would have to apply themselves differently. Yeah.
So there is a section that feels that the developments of the past few weeks, what happened in Parliament with the decision to go ahead with investigating the public protector, her fitness to hold office, and now this NEC decision. There are some that feel that Ramaphosa's grip on power is being strengthened. Analysis on one newspaper at the weekend said Ramaphosa is 2 steps ahead of his detractors. Is this true?
I definitely think so, at least to the extent that he's exercised influence and authority over the NEC, and you quite saw that on 2 moments, as you just mentioned right now, on the issue of the national chairperson and Tate Gwede Mantashe going to Parliament, giving effectively a 5-minute rundown of what's expected of parliamentarians on the matter of the PP, and then similarly just the recent issue of the step aside clause. Certainly, I think he's strengthening his hold of the party. I think it has beckoned on the part of the ANC NEC that they cannot continue in the manner that they have with the 2 factions, because on the one hand there's this push towards RET implementation, saying that he's slow to implement. But I think on the other hand, on the side of the faction Yabo and Ramaphosa, you can't implement some of these things when you have a trust deficit in society, and I think they're quite aware of that, and there's a need then to deal with some of these issues publicly. So I think that's where the ANC is definitely with regards to those issues.
And finally, let's just talk about developments in the Free State. That Supreme Court of Appeal decision coming out last week saying that the current executive was put in place unconstitutionally. Reports saying that President Cyril Ramaphosa could just swoop in quickly and appoint an interim structure just to ensure that the opposing forces are completely out. Can we see that happening?
Look, I think I think it would be very difficult because if my mind serves, if my memory serves me correctly, there was somehow a deal made between at the time Ismagashule over that issue of the Free State. So I don't think there's going to be any sort of intervention at the moment. I think there was an expectation that the judgment would go in that direction, but to that extent, I'm not quite privy to a lot of the details as to so I'm not able to speculate on the part of the president. But obviously, you'd be very careful not to now continue, given his asserting of his authority, to delve into matters that are not quite yet settled, at least on the part of the Free State. But that's what I can say on that matter.
Totally understand. And thank you so much for talking to us this morning, Thapelo.
Thank you again.